So continuing on with the carbon cycle for chapter 5, starting on page 122, pause the video and sketch this out. The picture here is really confusing. This is a simpler picture that shows the basic cycling of carbon. So again, pause the video and sketch it out. I'm going to go over it though. You have producers through photosynthesis give oxygen to consumers. So there's our oxygen. Through cellular respiration, we give carbon dioxide to producers. Now, carbon dioxide does not turn into oxygen. Actually, carbon gets stuck on the mass of the producers, and then water molecules turn into oxygen in the process of photosynthesis. So carbon builds mass in, it's called carbon sequestration, builds mass in producers. Okay, some other things that happen is when anything dies, so producers and consumers die, it puts carbon in the ground. Over millions of years, that can turn into fossil fuels. So ancient carbon that has been decomposed in the ground, that's a test question. So decomposed carbon over millions of years can turn into fossil fuels. And then as humans, we burn these fossil fuels and the CO2 goes into the atmosphere. We can also burn trees, or ethanol is made out of corn to release atmospheric CO2. Here are some ways that humans alter the carbon cycle. We mine and burn fossil fuels. We cut down forests. So when you cut down a forest, you prevent the tree from taking in more carbon. If you burn that forest or you burn those trees, now that carbon's going into the atmosphere. All of these things, all these three things add CO2 in the atmosphere, which cause global warming. We have a slow carbon cycle and we have a fast carbon cycle. So rock, soil, ocean, and atmosphere cycle carbon really, really slowly, like hundreds, thousands, millions of years. But carbon can be cycled quickly through organisms. So here we go. Up here, this is fast carbon cycle. This stuff in the ground is slow carbon cycle. Now, it's also, there's some other places. The ocean, the soil, the rocks, all these things have carbon and they keep them for a long period of time. And they're not in the sketch up here. Let's move on to the nitrogen cycle. So you should pause the video to draw this out, but I'm going to talk about it. This looks complicated, but it's actually simpler than the picture underneath it. So let's talk about nitrogen cycle. You have to know all these names. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. So first let's learn that nitrogen gas is the most abundant gas in our atmosphere. But plants can't use this form. It's very stable, it's inert, and so what happens is it has to go through nitrogen fixation. It can do it through a lightning strike, but most of it happens through nitrogen fixing bacteria on the roots of legumes. So we have a legume and there's these little nodules here that create, and that's NH3. The bacteria live in the nodules, so the legumes don't do nitrogen fixation. The bacteria on their roots in these nodules do nitrogen fixation. And what it does is it turns it into nitrates that plants can use. So this nitrate, NO3, plants use and grow from this nitrates. They like it. Then plants are eaten by animals, which is called assimilation. Actually, the plants taking in nitrates is also called assimilation. So anytime plants and animals get nitrates, either from eating or absorbing it, it's called assimilation. But then animals poop, and they poop out ammonia. And the process of nitrification turns it into nitrites first, and then nitrates, and then plants can use it again. Up here, I told you that nitrogen-fixing bacteria, actually, let me go on this way. So we have poop, that's ammonia, and then we also have dead things. that turn into ammonia. So poop and dead things make ammonia, which we call ammonification. So the pooping and dead things cause ammonification. And then this ammonia can turn into nitrates. So this is why in our eco columns we colonized with the wet allodia. So the water on the wet allodia brought over good bacteria, because nitrifying bacteria turn this ammonia into nitrates, which the plants want. They want it in the form of nitrates. And ammonia is toxic to living things too, especially fish. Okay, and then nitrates can actually go back into nitrogen gas through the process of denitrification. Okay, so you need to know that most reservoirs in the nitrogen cycle hold nitrogen for a short time. The atmosphere is the largest reservoir. We don't have a slow and fast nitrogen cycle like we do for the carbon cycle. So most of these reservoirs, it's a short amount of time. Going on to, you can skip 124, you can skip 125, and we have a whole bunch here to write. Okay, so we just talked about this. Now we're going to write it on sticky notes. So nitrogen fixation is turning nitrogen gas into ammonia. And so back on that picture, I have NH3 on that picture, but I said nitrates. So it's NH3. So it's going to be through lightning strikes or nitrogen fixing bacteria on the roots of legumes, or there's something called cyanobacteria that lives in water that can do the same thing. So it can do nitrogen fixation. Our next one is nitrification. And this is where ammonia is first turned into nitrites, then nitrates. And so these are different bacteria. Plants like nitrates. They don't like ammonia very much. They like nitrates. It's easier for them to use and absorb. Denitrification is kind of the easy one. It's just going back to, it's from nitrates to nitrogen gas. And then over here we have assimilation and ammonification. So assimilation is just living things taking in nitrates through their roots or by eating. And then ammonification is decomposition in animal waste to have ammonia. This is toxic to aquatic life. And yes, you need to know these symbols too of which is which. So the chemical formula NH3, and then up here NO3, N2. Here's how humans alter the nitrogen cycle. So there's this process called the Haber-Bosch. So it's Mr. Haber, Mr. Bosch, who discovered the process where you can actually make synthetic nitrogen. And so first they made it for bombs, but then after World War II, it was made for all this fertilizer, all these excess nitrates for bombs, nitrogen for bombs was turned into fertilizer. We burn fossil fuels and release NO2, which is an air pollutant. As humans, we plant a lot of legumes, soy. So in some places where there's big soy harvests, they actually have too much nitrates because the roots on the legumes, and here's a picture of the bacteria on the roots of legumes, they create too much nitrogen. We also, and you'll learn this later on, you'll learn about burning fossil fuels and air pollution and acid rain later on. But NO2 mixed with water creates nitric acid, which is part of acid rain. And again, we'll learn about that later on in the book, chapter 17. Going on to page 127, we have the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is you need to know this information. The largest reservoir is rocks and sediments. The weathering of rock releases it into ecosystems. It's a limiting factor because phosphorus is stable and insoluble, so it doesn't like to transform. And so unless something erodes from rocks, or you have dead things or poop, you're not getting phosphorus. We cannot make it in the lab, so it's not synthetic. Nitrogen we can make in the lab. Phosphorus we cannot. So weathering of rock, or we can harvest it from guano, which is seagull poop or bat cave poop. So these caves that bats have lived in forever and ever have valuable guano, which is a high source of phosphorus for fertilizers. It's the only cycle that we've learned. So we've just learned the hydraulic, which is the water cycle, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and now phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus has no air reservoir. So that's a test question too. Down here is a simple drawing. So basically, producers, consumers, we eat the plants and we get phosphorus, and then we poop out phosphorus, or when we die or decomposed, releases phosphorus. So this is matter that's recycled. Mining of guano or manure or rocks gives us phosphorus, which we can give to our plants. The weathering of rocks in nature gives us phosphorus for nature. And then the last page for this chapter that you need to know is the ways that humans alter the phosphorus cycle. We use detergent with phosphorus in it. Actually, that's been banned in California the last couple of years because of this problem. So detergents, if they're not disposed of properly, can get into rivers and streams and cause eutrophication. Untreated sewage, so human poop is actually super high in phosphorus. Other animals have high nitrates, but we have high phosphorus in our waste. We also use crop fertilizer which has phosphorus in it. And then here, these bullet points are ways to prevent eutrophication. The first one's actually terrible. I graded this question once on the AP test. So I went and graded like 2,000 of them one year with other graders. And the question was, describe a way to reduce eutrophication. And if kids just wrote reducing fertilizer use on farms and lawns, it didn't say how to reduce it. So any of these things are how to reduce it. So this first bullet point wouldn't get you any points. The rest of them, which explains how to reduce it, actually would get you the points. And that's it for chapter 5.